Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Gwaltney.
Well, here we are again in 2017. And the year is still very new for us. We're very happy to be with you this morning to continue our study about creation. And we're in the book of Psalms, and we'll continue for more weeks after today, looking at some Psalms that maybe some of them are not very familiar to us, but they certainly are very, very important. And we have Psalm 96 this morning.
This is a wonderful psalm. This is one that we are familiar with and think about a lot, sing to the Lord a new song. This psalm celebrates two wonderful things about God, Creator and King.
Yes.
Both of those are being celebrated in this psalm.
Right, and in fact, this psalm is viewed by some modern scholars. Mm-hmm. They're always looking for a situation in the life of the nation where a particular psalm might fit as having been a part of the liturgy for that occasion. Mm-hmm. And this one has really been picked on because of the use of one big word in it, which we'll look at and see. The verb to reign, to become king.
The Lord reigns.
Well, it's translated, though, by these as the Lord has become king, and it is thought then that there was a ceremony in the fall around New Year's time in their calendar when it's like the world was having to be reestablished, and so they picture God as entering the city and taking the throne and being re-enthroned every year, which gave stability and promise that the new year is going to be a good year with a lot of safety and a lot of good things that would happen. So a New Year's psalm, if you please.
To celebrate God as Creator and the one who continues to sustain and rule all of creation.
He rules and protects and makes sure that the nation goes on, lives on.
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things about Psalm 96 is that we have the impression that it was used at a specific time in the history of Israel, referred to in 1 Chronicles.
That's right. This psalm, almost verbatim, is to be found in 1 Chronicles chapter 16. And the setting there is the time when David had captured Jerusalem and purged the Jebusites, and then settled people from Judah, the tribe of Judah, in Jerusalem. It became his own personal city, became known as the City of David. One of the things he wanted to do was to make the capital also the religious center. And so he had the Ark of the Covenant brought into the city, and 1 Chronicles 16 is the celebration of the coming of the Ark into the city of Jerusalem, and it is put in a tent where it will await Solomon's temple.
Yeah. And so one of the interesting things here is that the ark symbolized for the ancient Israelite people the presence of God in the midst of his people.
Right.
And so I think one of the things we can be looking for as we study through Psalm 96 are suggestions about the nature of God, the presence of God among his people.
Right.
But at the same time, it's not just human beings who are worshiping God, but all creation is praising God.
Right, and even then, there is the theme that God, Yahweh, the God of Israel, is in fact the God of the whole world. and the psalm calls for all people to declare God's kingship.
Right. You know, we had a series of lessons from the book of Revelation recently, and I was thinking as I studied this psalm that there's something a little similar going on in the book of Revelation, where we see this grand vision of the throne room of God, and surrounding the throne of God are the four living creatures who symbolically stand for all creation.
Yes.
They have all these different heads of animals and things like that. So they stand for all creation. But then you also have human beings around the throne
24
as well, the elders.
Yes.
The elders. So in a sense, the book of Revelation is proclaiming the same thing, that all people worship Yahweh,
Yes.
worship God
Yes.
into eternity, and all creation worships God
Yes.
into eternity.
Yes. So
Yeah.
it's a kind of a theme that runs throughout the Old Testament and even through the career of Jesus. And certainly one of the big issues confronting the church, as we read about it in the book of Acts and the letters of Paul, the whole idea that the kingdom of God is not for just a few, it's for the entire world.
Right, right.
So
Well, the theme we have today is this new song theme.
Yes.
And it's interesting, in the Greek language.
Is this a call for us to accept new kinds
of music in worship? Well, maybe so. A lot of us have been adjusting lately over the last few years, haven't we?
Trying to
singing a new song, singing a new kind of song. Well, it's interesting. The Greek word that's used for new here in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament is the word that means a new kind of something, not just a newer one in time, but a whole new kind of something. And so as David established a new capital and a new center of worship and brought in the ark for a new location of the tabernacle, they evidently were singing, it was time for a new song.
Could I also play off of what you just said and say that in Hebraic mind, the kingdom had to be renewed annually.
Okay.
And so it's time then for a new song every year.
Yeah.
To celebrate the return of the rule of God over the world, established from his throne in the city of Jerusalem.
Well, you know, that's not a bad reminder for a lesson in the new year, as we are here, where we are reminded of God's sovereignty and reign in our lives.
Yes.
We don't just take it for granted that it continues, but we stop and are reminding ourselves of God's reign.
Well, you know, among many Christian groups, there is an annual cycle that, you know, not all Christian groups will celebrate this cycle, but nevertheless, there's something reassuring about having the Christian year, you know, begin with Advent and then run through the rest of the year. It gives a sense of stability.
And you're saying ancient Jews had a similar kind of
exactly,
thing.
Exactly.
Yeah, even though they had a different calendar.
Yes.
Well, why don't you read for us
All right.
this psalm about how all creation and all creatures give praise to God.
And I will not attempt to sing it
Good.
as a new
Thank
song.
you.
All right, Psalm 96. Sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord, all the earth. Sing to the Lord, praise his name, proclaim his salvation day after day. Declare his glory among the nations, his marvelous deeds among all peoples. For great is the Lord, and most worthy of praise. He is to be feared among all gods, above all gods. For all the gods of the nations are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. Splendor and majesty are before him. Strength and glory are in his sanctuary. Ascribe to the Lord, all you families of nations. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Bring an offering and come into his courts. Worship the Lord in the splendor of his holiness. Tremble before him, all the earth. Say among the nation, the Lord reigns. The world is firmly established. It cannot be moved. He will judge the peoples with equity. Let the heavens rejoice. Let the earth be glad. Let the sea resound and all that is in it. Let the fields be jubilant and everything in them. Let all the trees of the forest sing for joy. Let all creation rejoice before the Lord, for he comes. He comes to judge the earth. He will judge the world in righteousness and the peoples in his faithfulness. That's the entire psalm.
That is, and it's a beautiful psalm.
I tried to read it in such a way as to show that it is poetry.
Mm-hmm. It is.
It is not prose. It's poetry.
Right. And it's there's some distinctive poetic features in this particular psalm. The way the initial verb is repeated, and so it kind of builds in intensity.
Yes.
In verses 1 and 2, we get that sing, 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 praise, proclaim. That builds there.
And they're all in the imperative form.
Sure. And then we're going to get the same kind of feel in verses 7 and 8. Ascribe to the Lord, ascribe to the Lord, ascribe to the Lord, ascribe, bring an offering. It builds and builds there. So this is very beautifully written, very powerfully written.
Now this is an observed form of Hebraic poetry. Mm-hmm. And there are several characteristics of poetry in the Old Testament era in their language. Mm-hmm. And it is to have things said, you might say, in parallel with one another and in metrical arrangement. Mm-hmm. And you see that in this psalm. One particular, I think, one of the highest forms of poetic form is, as you have said, in verses 7 and 8. Where the poem builds by adding to the statement steadily, progressive. The parallelism progresses. So parallelism, where the same idea is expressed 2 times or more, sometimes it's even 3. And then the progressive form of parallelism. These are all characteristics of poetry. Yeah. Not very much rhyming in the Hebrew language, but occasionally. Mm-hmm. But very definitely metrical patterns were used.
Yeah. Well, the verse 1 says, "Sing to the Lord all the earth," and the question may come to mind, does that mean the planet Earth, or does that mean the people of the earth?
And it could mean both.
And I think in this psalm it means both. I really do. Because in this psalm we have human beings and nations, people, families, praising God. But we also clearly have the heavens rejoicing and the sea resounding as well.
And we've talked about this last week in terms of the psalm. It's as if these inanimate objects are non-human objects, are given human characteristics, personas. Right. And they are expected then, because they are under the authority of God, just as surely as anyone, to do homage before God. So they are personified. It's one of their tricks, poetic devices to explain and to express how all of creation then adores God, and respects God, reveres God.
I think it's a good reminder to Christians, that creation care needs to be part of our vision and part of our mission as Christians. I think these Psalms suggest to us that the creation around us, the trees and the mountains and the rivers, are our fellow worshipers of God, as it were.
Yes.
And I think it should have an impact on the way in which we treat the natural world.
I'd like to echo that and amen it, because when one reads back in Genesis, one of the characteristics that is stated most powerfully is that human beings are put here to care for what has been created. We're sort of like a shop foreman, a superintendent. Caretakers in behalf of God. And that concept, I think, is a very important concept and is implied here.
Yeah, good. Verse 2 is beautiful. It starts out with the third repetition of this sing to the Lord, but then it goes on to praise His name. That's the word praise that's sometimes translated bless, to bless His name.
Yes, it is.
Bless His name.
There are two kinds of blessings in the Old Testament and also in the New Testament. This is to bless in terms of doing good for, and it implies action.
Okay.
Speaking, of course.
Speaking well of and doing good for.
Yeah, and another, it's interesting, a choice of words in verse 2, the second line, sing, praise, and then the word that's used here is a word to announce good news.
You're talking about the word that's translated proclaim in the NIV.
Yes.
You say in Hebrew means to announce good news.
Yes.
Well, and the Greek translation in the Septuagint, it does the very same thing. It means to announce good news.
In other words, it's the term in Greek from which we get gospel.
Yes, evangelism.
Yeah.
So it means something like announce the good news of God's salvation.
Right.
I could paraphrase that.
Yes.
A little bit. Announce the good news of God's salvation.
And then the next term is recount. I would translate the first verb in 3 as
declare,
recount.
Yeah.
Because the base of the word is to count and take an account of.
Okay.
But it's in an intensive form and with the sense of recount. We have that concept in our language.
Yeah. Back
to enumerate.
Okay. Back to praise His name early in verse 2.
Yeah.
The word name there, they're not using that literally to mean the name of God, are they?
That's the way the Jewish tradition takes it. Based on, you shall not take the name of Yahweh your God in emptiness, vanity, vain. I once had a student who wrote vain, V-E-I-N.
Oh, no. Don't take the name of the Lord your God in vain.
In your veins.
Intravenously. Don't take it intravenously.
Yeah. But anyway, it means as a powerless word.
Yeah.
Name represents the entire individual.
There, okay. Yeah.
In their way of looking at it.
So it's not just the sound of the name or the letters of the name that we're talking about here, but the name as it represents the person of God.
Exactly.
So praise His name doesn't just mean
praise
saying,
His character.
God, you have a really great name. I like your name.
Yeah.
No, it's more than that. It's praising the person, character, nature of God.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Now, in verse 4 and 5, we have a reference to other gods. He is to be feared above all gods. For all
revered, I would understand the word fear here.
Yeah. For all the gods of the nations are idols. And this is a common Jewish way of thinking about idolatry, isn't it?
You might think that what is being said here is that Israel, or the poet, is accepting the presence of other gods, but that Yahweh is the supreme God over all the other gods. That would be, I think, a mistake. The rabbis looked at it this way. There are other gods to the extent that other people think there are other gods. And so they would put it this way: what others call gods, to them they are real, but we know better. So it should be looked at that way.
Yeah. And one of the ways in which the prophets talked about idolatry is kind of echoed here as well.
Exactly.
They said, why do you worship things that you have made with your own hands? And here it says the gods of the nations are mere idols.
Well, I think the most interesting way to put it is one of the prophets says, how stupid can you be? You take a piece of wood and you whittle out a character, and then you bow down before it as your God. The rest of the wood you burn so that you can have something to eat. You heat your food with it.
Right.
Now, there's something a little bit inconsistent here.
Yeah. One of the things that Paul talks about in the early part of the letter to the Romans is the kind of the irony of idolatry. God created the world, and the world, Paul thinks, gives testimony to all people of the nature and presence of God. But instead of seeing creation as a testimony to God, people started worshiping creation instead. And so they worship the sun as a god, and the moon as a god, and the earth, and
or the act of reproduction.
Yeah.
Or whatever, the storm, the tree, they all are powers. What makes a tree a god? Well, it lives frequently in that part of the world a whole lot longer than humans do. So it must be superior. Well, if it's superior, that makes it a god.
Right.
Which is a kind of a comical logic.
Yeah. But this psalm makes it clear that although other people worship what they think are gods, these are idols. These are things of their own manufacturing, and the Lord made the heavens. In other words, God made everything, so we don't worship something that we have made.
The irony here is that God made the heavens, but humans make the idols.
Made the so-called gods.
They can't make it. Those gods they make can't make anything.
Yeah. Well, now we come to verses 6 and following, where we get a whole string of beautiful words describing some of the characteristics of God. Back in verse 2, we saw that God is a God of salvation. And in verse 3, God is a God of glory.
Yes.
And verse 4, God is a great God, worthy of praise and to be revered.
And reverenced.
Reverenced and feared in that sense. But now in verse 6, look at this list of words here. Splendor and majesty, strength and glory. Verse 7, glory and strength again.
Yeah. Now, by the way, in the word, there's one simple word, it's an imperative word, that is used here in 7 and 8. And I think we should understand that the word is give, in the sense of give to the Yahweh, or to the Lord, all you families of the nations. Give to the Lord glory and strength.
Yeah, the Greek translation uses the word bring, which is similar to give. So there's ascribe is an English word that might just suggest a mental activity of thinking.
Yeah.
And this is much more intense than that. It's this idea of bringing praise and glory to God.
In the form of
and
worship.
honor to God. Right, which is then clarified at in the latter part of verse 8.
And then verse 9.
Bring an offering. And it's the
Precisely.
word, I think it's the word sacrifices.
Yes.
Isn't it?
Mincha in
not
Hebrew.
just an offering of money necessarily, but sacrifices to God.
The specified sacrifices, yes.
Yeah, and come into His courts, and then this becomes a way in which we worship God in the splendor of His holiness.
The word worship in 9 is a very provocative word. It means to prostrate yourself. It goes beyond kneeling. It means lying face down, totally on the earth. And that was the posture you took when you were a person appearing before the king.
Okay. Now, when we get to verse 10, we finally reach this other point. I said at the beginning that this is a psalm that celebrates God as both creator and king.
Yes.
And it's here in verse 10 that we see that royal imagery.
And some say he becomes a king all over again annually. Yes.
So say among the nations, the Lord reigns. And then we get another hint of creation here in the latter part of verse 10. The world is firmly established and cannot be moved or cannot be shaken. So God's sovereignty extends not only over a nation, but over all creation.
Yes. Now, we should make one comment before we run out of time. There's a whole lot in this section of the psalm, a whole lot about judging.
Yeah.
And we may get the wrong impression from this as if judging is sinister, but not so. It may be sinister in human courts, but not in God's court.
Okay.
To judge means that God is setting things right. And it is not a negative term. God judges. That is to put things right and to make sure that the people's rights, appropriate rights, are observed, and that those that have been damaged are made whole. And so judgment here, as God is described, is not the nitpicking kind of a character that sometimes he's
always looking for faults.
Yeah. He is looking to make things right.
And that's why judgment is associated in this psalm with
equity.
3 important qualities. In verse 10, judgment of God is associated with equity or uprightness.
Yes.
And then in verse 13, the judgment of God is associated with righteousness.
Yes.
And faithfulness or truth.
Right.
And so this is God bringing about, God acting out of His faithfulness, out of His sense of righteousness, His sense of equity, to make things right.
The judgments of God are fair, correct, and bring about salvation.
So God's judgment isn't looking for wrongs, it's making things right.
Making things right.
Yeah.
Well, we could have said a little bit more about this psalm, but the time has expired, and so we have to say goodbye for this morning. But we'll come back and be working in another psalm about creation and God as creator next Sunday. We hope you will join us, and may you have a wonderful week. In God's name.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.